was in the Oh, here it comes. We have the elite, so. Good morning. You can catch your breath. The hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's Members' Day hearing. I look forward to this annual hearing because it gives us the opportunity to hear from our colleagues on the budget issues of great importance to them. We appreciate everyone for appearing before the committee this morning and look forward to your testimony. I will now yield myself 5 minutes, which I won't use, for an opening statement. Last year, with the support of both Republican and Democratic members of this committee, and after months of deliberations, Congress put in place bipartisan budgets for 2020 and 2021, complete with rational discretionary top lines allowing strong investments in our national and economic security. As that work was underway, I used this chairmanship to revitalize the committee with the goal of providing much more aggressive oversight of the budget. We have held hearings addressing some of the biggest economic issues facing our nation, including the benefits of immigration reform, the costs of climate change, aging infrastructure, income inequality, the potential costs of debt, the federal government's vital role in mitigating economic downturns, tax policy, and more. These issues will continue to impact and in some cases dictate our nation's economic outlook and fiscal health. So while we already have a budget in place for this year and the next, at the pace Congress moves, it is never too early to start preparing for 2022. With the expiration of the Budget Control Act of 2011, the budget resolution will once again be Congress's primary tool for developing and enforcing our fiscal policies. This hearing will provide us with an opportunity to hear the budget priorities of our colleagues as we move forward with those discussions. At the same time, and in the face of a president who has flouted our budget laws and repeatedly trampled the lines of executive budgetary power, this committee will fight to enforce and strengthen Congress's power of the purse, provide oversight of the people's budget, and ensure that the warped vision the president presented in his 2021 budget does not come to fruition. Good governing and responsible budgeting requires smart, often difficult choices. This process begins by evaluating the trade-offs our choices require while taking into consideration the long-term effects and benefits. It includes considering both revenues and spending, and our goal must be to better serve the American taxpayers and prepare our nation's budget for the future. It is my hope that this hearing will provide insight into which issues and longer-term budgetary challenges this committee should examine as we work to build an economy that works for all Americans, not just the wealthy and corporations. I thank members for taking time out of their busy schedules and speaking before the committee today. I look forward to hearing from each of you. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member.
I thank the chairman. Each year, this hearing is an important step in the Budget Committee's task of crafting a budget resolution for the fiscal year. It provides members of the committee the opportunity to hear from our colleagues from across the country. Historically, their diverse voices have been an important part of the conversation to map out the nation's fiscal blueprint. But this year's a bit different. Why are we having this hearing when we aren't doing a budget resolution? I don't think a single member of this committee would deny the importance of gathering input from our colleagues to help inform decision-making in the budget process. However, we didn't do a budget last year. We're not going to do a budget this year, so I have to question the point of the exercise today. This committee's failure to execute its central responsibility and put forward a budget should be deeply unsettling to everyone here and at home. Why? Our fiscal trajectory. It is not sustainable. Unless we take significant action, this trend will soon begin to impact every aspect of American life, from the strength of our economy to national security efforts. Last month, CBO Director Phil Swagel told us that in fiscal 20, the deficit will be over $1 trillion. That's with a T. That's an increase of $31 billion from last year, the first year since fiscal 12 that the deficit will eclipse $1 trillion. It gets worse. On the current path, the deficits are projected to eclipse $1 trillion every year over the next 10. That's more than $13 trillion over the budget window by fiscal 2030. So what's driving these deficits? The answer is pretty simple: out of control, unchecked, mandatory spending. Today, mandatory spending accounts for 70% of the federal budget. It's on track to reach an alarming 76% by fiscal 2030. Because our country's mandatory spending continues to balloon, federal spending will consume an ever-expanding share of economic resources. It will rise from 21% of GDP this year to 23.5% of GDP in 2030. Now that's far in excess of the 20.4% annual average of the past 50 years. Now, what do these numbers mean for hardworking American families and workers? Simply put, it's not good. It means that the programs they're paying into today and are counting on for tomorrow may not be available when they need them the most. It also means that there will be fewer dollars for essential government operations such as defense, homeland security, education, maybe even COVID-19. Despite these very real fiscal challenges and warnings from outside experts, we continue to hear about Democrat proposals with astronomical price tags: Medicare for all, the Green New Deal. They'll propose budget-busting policies, but they won't produce a budget. So I will continue to ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, how will you reconcile your party's desire to uncontrollably spend with a pressing need to address the exploding national debt? How will you do this without crafting a budget for the second straight year? We have a moral obligation to get our fiscal house in order. If we don't act, the burden of our irresponsibility will be left on the backs of our children and our grandchildren, and as I often say in my meetings at home, our grandchildren's grandchildren. The most logical step toward reversing course is this committee to do its most basic job: pass a budget, take it to the floor, and let's have a robust discussion about the priorities of our country. I trust and hope that my colleagues will reflect on this point. And Mr. Chairman, before I yield back the balance of my time, recognize the fact that you were with me when we were trying to do process reform that would actually lead to this committee, strengthen this committee, and get this committee back on the path of doing its job. And it's high time that we get back to that business. I yield back the balance.
I thank the ranking member for his comments, and yes, we tried. We can continue to try. As I will now begin to recognize the members in order of their arrival here. As a reminder, members appearing before the committee will have 5 minutes to give their oral testimony, and their written statements will be made part of the formal hearing record. In addition, members of the committee will be permitted to question witnesses following their statements, but out of consideration for our colleagues' time, I would ask that you please keep your comments brief. And with that, I recognize the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Yermuth and Ranking Member Womack. I want to thank you for this opportunity for members to bring our legislative priorities before the Budget Committee today. I'm here to speak with you about H.R. 1128, the Indian Programs Advanced Appropriation Act. As Chair of the Interior, Environment, and Appropriations Committee, I have heard from tribal leaders for many years about the difficulties of operating essential government services in the areas of healthcare, education, and public safety under the uncertainty of continuing resolutions and shutdowns. It was at the request of those tribal leaders that I introduced H.R. 1128, which has 48 bipartisan co-sponsors, along with Republican and Democratic appropriators who are our co-sponsors. We did this in order to provide much-needed stability to tribal governments and to Native American communities. Providing federal funds for Indian programs a full year in advance will ensure that the federal government can better meet its commitment to uphold trust and treaty responsibilities throughout Indian country. It's an important issue of pressing importance for all tribal nations, and I'm proud to say that the congressional effort on this issue has truly not been just bipartisan, but nonpartisan, as Mr. Womack can attest to the work that we do in our committee on this issue. The 35-day government shutdown last year put a tragic spotlight on the clear need for advanced appropriations for the Bureaus of Indian Affairs, Indian education, and for the Indian Health Service. Access to insulin, physical therapy was compromised when clinics had to close or cut back services at their clinics. Basic everyday needs like tribal justice services, social services for children, families, and seniors went unfunded, putting Native American communities at risk. Emergency maintenance staff for tribal schools were unavailable, and roads went unplowed in the snow, impacting public safety. The federal government has a legal and moral responsibility to ensure funding for our trust and treaty responsibilities, and that is not interrupted by delays in appropriations. H.R. 1128 provides advance appropriations to ensure that a future shutdown would not disrupt the critical funding for that Native communities rely on. Within the Interior Appropriations Bill, we have already dedicated resources over several years to achieve forward funding in some parts, the Bureau of Indian Education budget. That meant that tribal schools could keep operating during a shutdown, successfully protecting Native American students' education. But without this committee, the Budget Committee's help, we simply do not have the ability to provide advance funding for all of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Services budgets. Each year, the Interior Appropriations Committee holds 2 days of public witness hearings with tribal leaders to hear about funding priorities in Indian country. For the past 2 years, we have heard overwhelmingly, again and again, about the priority of advanced appropriations for tribal nations. While government shutdowns are damaging to all of our communities, they are disproportionately harmful to Native Americans. We cannot allow the health and safety of tribal communities to be put at risk because the House or the Senate or the administration can't finish their work on time. Because of the federal government's past failures, tribal governments, tribal organizations, and our fellow Americans representing hundreds of individual tribal nations support advanced appropriations for Indian country. I would like to submit for the record letters and resolutions from the National Congress of American Indians, the National Indian Health Board, Self-Governance Communication and Education Tribal Consortium, and other tribal governments and regional tribal organizations. They call on Congress to act in vast appropriations for our basic trust and treaty responsibilities. Thankfully, this committee already has a model to look to where Congress provided advance appropriations to uphold its obligations. In 2009, Congress overwhelmingly passed legislation to provide Veterans Health Administration with advanced appropriations. In every budget resolution, the House now provides an exception for allowing for advanced appropriations for the medical services and the facilities provided for the VA. We took steps to ensure that our national commitment to care for our veterans was supported with a stable budget, even in uncertain political times. Our fellow citizens throughout Indian country deserves no less when it comes to their health care and their safety. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, I thank you for the time.
I thank the gentlewoman, and without objection, her submissions will be included in the record. So ordered. Are there any comments or questions of Ms. McCollum? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank the committee.
I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. So as a small business owner and someone who brings an outsider's perspective to Washington, I want to sound the alarm on our country's out-of-control fiscal situation. Right now, the national debt stands at more than $23 trillion, which is roughly the equivalent of $70,000 for each man, woman, and child in America. And the budget deficit is set to break $1 trillion this year. We have to take action and reverse course. The path we're on is simply unsustainable and risks triggering a financial crisis that would undermine the prosperity of the American people. That's why I recently introduced a resolution along with my fellow members of the North Carolina delegation calling for an end to Washington's spending addiction. My resolution simply states that Congress should not raise the debt ceiling without making significant fiscal and spending reforms that would put us back on track towards a balanced budget. More specifically, I launched a series called, and you'll enjoy this, Bud's Budget Busters, to highlight examples of government waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement, along with common sense solutions that Congress can act on to save taxpayer dollars. The first instance of government waste I highlighted is the millions of taxpayer dollars being sent to individuals who are not even alive. For example, A 2015 Social Security Administration Inspector General report found that 6.5 million people in the system that are implausibly 112 years or older. The Department of Veterans Affairs paid out an estimated $37.7 million to deceased veterans in 2016. Over $1 billion has been paid to farmers who have been dead for over 3 years. Medicare paid for $3.6 million in prescription drugs for dead beneficiaries. The fact that the federal government is unable to distinguish between the living and the dead is simply absurd, especially when a simple fix is available. That's why I applaud my colleague, Representative Gianforte, for introducing H.R. 2543, the appropriately named Stop Improper Payments to Deceased People Act. The bill grants federal agencies access to Social Security Administration's death database and puts new procedures in place that force agencies to consider death data before making payments. Passing legislation like this is common sense and simply a no-brainer. Another example of government waste that I highlighted was the fact that 75% of the federal government's IT funding goes towards maintaining outdated legacy software. For example, the Department of Justice and the Social Security Administration still operate programming code from the 1950s and 1960s. The Department of Treasury still uses a pair of nearly 60-year-old systems. The Department of Veterans Affairs maintains veterans benefits on more than a 50-year-old system. Most incredibly, the Department of Defense uses an over 50-year-old system of 8-inch floppy disks to operate our country's nuclear arsenal. As the tech revolution continues to impact every aspect of our lives, we have to make sure that our government isn't left in the dust. The private sector can be a vital resource for demonstrating how to effectively modernize cutting-edge tools like cloud and blockchain and digital ledger technology. That's why Congress should perform enhanced oversight in the form of hearings and testimony that enact new legislation where it would be needed. Agencies and departments should be held accountable for the snail's pace of technological change in our federal bureaucracy. In the 3 years that I've been here, I've voted against many budgets that ignore our national debt and kick the can further down the road. But I look forward to working with all of you to reverse course and start pursuing policies that will reduce our national debt for our kids and for our grandkids. The time is now to rein in Washington's spending addiction. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I yield back.
Thank you for your testimony, and I particularly appreciate your calling attention to the fact that a lot of our technological capabilities in this country are so outmoded, and that's, I think, an important thing that this Congress ought to focus very intently on.
Thank you.
Do any other members have any comments or questions? Thank you again for your testimony, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Republican Leader Womack, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present priorities for fiscal year 2021. I want today to discuss healthcare, technological advancements and deployment, and energy solutions. Of course, I sit on the Committee on Energy and Commerce, and these are the priorities on the Republican side of the dais, at least in the Committee on Energy and Commerce. First off, we know Americans care about how much they are spending on prescription drugs. They worry about their ability to afford the medications that they need. Some patients ration their insulin while others choose between medications and food. There is a bipartisan consensus that Congress can act to bring down prescription drug costs. We considered Medicare Part D reform, including capping seniors' out-of-pocket costs. The Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means put out bipartisan requests for information and received more than 80 responses. Unfortunately, these conversations were sidelined while attention was wrapped up in the Speaker's bill, H.R. 3, last October. So I urge other members to consider the provisions included in H.R. 19, the Lower Cost More Cures Act of 2019. This bill includes bipartisan solutions to lower drug costs and protects access to new treatments and new cures. H.R. 19 does cap out-of-pocket costs in Medicare Part D, protecting seniors from the high cost of prescription drugs, and caps that at $3,100 a year, caps the cost of insulin at $50 a month. H.R. 19 also contains provisions aimed at access to prescription drugs in rural areas by reforming the so-called direct and indirect remuneration fees largely administered by pharmacy benefit managers. There is a lot that Congress can be doing for the cost of drugs to deliver for the American people. H.R. 19 is an example of bipartisan policies that could become law and directly impact drug costs that patients incur. The provisions mentioned today are just some of the common sense and bipartisan solutions that should be considered. The fiscal year 2021 budget should include funding to ensure the United States' preeminence in fifth-generation mobile technology. The 5G rollout will require rural broadband deployment and a trained workforce to install the necessary infrastructure. In addition, the National Institute of Standards and Technology must have the resources to contribute to global 5G standards, and the National Telecommunication and Information Agency must manage the federal spectrum. This includes working with the Federal Communications Commission and industry to auction spectrum and protect current incumbents. Additionally, consumers are concerned about their data privacy. The Energy and Commerce Committee is currently negotiating federal privacy law that will require the oversight of the Federal Trade Commission to ensure that industry does not engage in deceptive practices when implementing privacy policies. The Federal Trade Commission will require technically trained personnel to fulfill this responsibility. Another technology, autonomous vehicles, the infamous self-driving car, will improve mobility and increase safety on our roadways, and we should prioritize funding for the National Highway Traffic Safety Agency to be able to certify the safety features of these vehicles, allow testing exemptions when necessary, but also issuing recalls and regulations where necessary. This includes expertise within the Office of Defects Investigations and a consumer-facing education campaign on recall completion. The traveling public deserves adequate resources to ensure their safety. The President's budget funds important energy research projects, including projects such as the Versatile Test Reactor, the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, and artificial intelligence capabilities. These smart investments in nuclear power, energy storage, and advanced computing will ensure energy independence and conservation for our future. Congress must consider resources for energy efficiency, including programs like the Energy Star. This has saved Americans billions of dollars and certainly should be preserved to ensure consumers make informed energy decisions. And let me just say, I agree with Ranking Member Womack about the absence of a budget. It is difficult to negotiate and navigate these issues without that. And in fact, yesterday in our hearing that we finally had on COVID-19, there was a lot of criticism about the President's budget, but it is difficult to criticize the President's budget when we will not propose our own budget in the People's House and have not for the last several Congresses. I appreciate the attention, and I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back, and I think it's safe to say the gentleman from Texas and I have rarely found areas of agreement over the years, but I find myself in agreement with much of what you said, and I thank you for your testimony. But I will say it is easy to criticize the President's budget without doing our own. But thank you for your testimony. Anybody else have a comment or question?
Was H.R. 19 subject to a markup?
H.R. 19 was considered as a Republican substitute to H.R. 3, so it didn't have its own separate markup for H.R. 19. Every one of those provisions had, at some point, had a legislative hearing and again, was included in the Republican amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank the gentleman.
Once again, Mr. Burgess, thank you for your testimony. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, members of the committee. I'm back again this year. I came last year to testify about the need to aggressively pursue a path to a balance in our federal budget and begin to address our exploding deficits and ballooning national debt. I think it's important to reiterate that we need to reintroduce 4 words to Washington that we use in Richmond and across state capitals time and time again. We can't afford it. Our federal debt is now over $23 trillion. It's discouraging to my constituents back home that the last time a federal budget with a surplus was signed into law was 1997, 23 years ago. As lawmakers, we need to restore confidence in Congress and in our federal government by restoring fiscal responsibility to our budget process. Balancing the federal budget has become a challenge because the federal government overreaches across a wide swath of areas. I commend past and current champions who are committed to undertaking the large job of balancing the budget by negotiating across the aisle, across chambers between the House and the Senate, and with both Democrat and Republican administrations. Such negotiations led to the deficit reductions that created the 1997 surplus. I'm committed to being a champion for a balanced budget and hope that the committee members will make that same commitment. The implication of failing to pass a budget, not even considering one that leads to balance, are grave. It puts our national security at risk, it steals opportunities from the hands of future generations, and it is ultimately unsustainable. The bottom line is that we ask Americans to balance their budgets, and as lawmakers who are entrusted by constituents to use discretion and exercise discipline when spending their hard-earned money, we must move and to craft and pass a fiscally responsible budget that balances to the forefront of our legislative agenda. And I thank the chairman for his time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I thank the gentleman. Any questions or comments from the members? Thank you very much for your testimony. And now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of this committee. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on certain national security priorities that I believe Congress should consider in this fiscal year 2021. To begin with, I'd like to let you know that I chair subcommittee in Homeland Transportation and Maritime Security. The issue there, the Coast Guard brought to my attention, is the Arctic and essentially our northern border. That is a northern border. Now that the Arctic has essentially melted, we have the Russians on the other side very close to us. We have issues, priorities of minerals, oil, fisheries, and navigation. Currently, Russia has icebreaker fleet of over 50 icebreakers. We have 2. Coast Guard has said they need at least 6 to begin to do their job adequately. And I would ask this committee to please consider funding the Coast Guard's procurement, construction, and improvement needs. It is essentially to guard our best interests on our northern border. Secondly, I'd like to turn to an issue of importance to my district and I think to the rest of the country, which is the National Network of Fusion Centers. These fusion centers essentially serve a very important role of information sharing of criminal activities and criminal threats. This network of 69 fusion centers do a really good job of working with the local, state, and federal agencies in coordinating, disseminating information when it comes to threats domestically, locally, and internationally. The President's proposal would cut these programs significantly. I would ask that we instead increase funding for these fusion centers and make sure that we safeguard our communities both at the federal, national level, and local level. With that, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of this committee for your time and interest.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. Any questions or comments of the member?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much once again. And now I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, for 5 minutes.
Thank you and good morning, Chairman, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, members of this committee. Thank you for having us here today. This committee is tasked with the important constitutional obligation placed on Congress in Article 1, Section 8 to determine how much revenue should be collected from the taxpayers and how much should be spent. The budget process is vital because it's within that budget framework that we evaluate proposed legislation to ensure that we're spending within agreed upon spending limits, or at least that's how it's supposed to work. Last year, I came to talk to you about a bill I introduced, H.R. 638, the Cost Estimates Improvement Act, which would require the CBO and JCT to include debt servicing costs in their estimates. I asked you to include it as part of the fiscal year 2020 budget process. We do not have the luxury of ignoring the true cost of our spending decisions. Our nation's outstanding debt is nearly $23.4 trillion and climbing, and by the time we meet this time next year in this committee, it'll be over $24 trillion. In fact, according to the most recent budget outlook from CBO, over the next 10 years, the annual deficits will reach $1.7 trillion. Our national debt will reach nearly $35 trillion, and our annual interest payments will be $819 billion. These numbers are so big that it's hard for the average person to comprehend, but they represent a real threat to our nation's financial future. And we are increasing the deficits and debt at these alarming rates without a full and complete picture of the legislation we're voting on because we regularly do not consider the interest cost. As Maya McGinnis of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget explains, if the interest on the debt is not counted, the official scores of legislation can be deceptively low, especially when offsets would occur years in the future. American taxpayers and future generations deserve honest accounting, not more gimmicks that attempt to paper over our huge and unsustainable deficits. The folks back home understand this. If they were budgeting for a monthly car payment and only considered the list price of the car itself and didn't factor in the extra cost of the interest payments, they might discover later that the actual cost was more than they could afford. In essence, Congress does this very same thing by not considering the comprehensive budgetary impact of spending and taxing proposals. This distorts congressional decision-making in favor of more spending and debt accumulation than might otherwise be the case. Simply put, the debt servicing costs in legislative cost estimates would better equip lawmakers to make informed spending decisions. My legislation also does one more important thing that would help lawmakers make better spending decisions. It requires cost estimates to include a list of duplicative programs with the covered legislation. For example, the President's budget documents released earlier this month noted that there are 91 federal programs to train healthcare professionals, and this is just one example of duplication across the federal government. If cost estimates were required to point out such duplication, it might give members pause before voting to spend more taxpayer dollars on duplicative programs, and it would give us a better awareness toward evaluating and improving current programs. But the good news is that while legislation requiring consideration of interest cost is preferred, we do not need legislation to pass in order for us to begin counting the real cost of proposed legislation. CBO is already capable of producing these numbers, and you have the power to ask for it in this committee. Last month, I sent a letter to the chairman and ranking member, as well as your counterparts in the U.S. Senate, a bipartisan letter signed by myself and 56 of our colleagues. In the letter, we ask that you direct the CBO to begin including debt servicing costs in all legislative cost estimates produced. Reining in our debt and our deficits only gets harder the longer we wait, and we owe it to our constituents, particularly those of future generations, to make spending decisions with the most accurate information possible. This isn't a red or blue issue, a Republican or Democrat issue. This is just simple good governance. I hope that you'll consider this cost estimates reform as an important step toward improving our budget process, and I do thank you again for your time here today. Appreciate it.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My colleague is exactly right. This isn't a red or blue issue. This is just common sense that every American, every business has to go through, everywhere, every state, everywhere except the federal government. We found many of those kind of things, and I think if you polled everybody individually, they would tell you the same thing. And why we can't do it, it's beyond me. I'm going to find the answer, though.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you very much once again, Mr. Cloud, and I want to thank again all the members who appeared here today and the members who attended the hearing, and that completes our business for the day. So without objection, this hearing is adjourned.